And thank you to Hitotsubashi University for inviting me, knowing that I'm not an economist, but a political scientist. And I'll talk about international politics in the context of the topic we have here. And I have labeled my presentation, it's also a political crisis, because I think it's important to think, look at those dimensions also. So that's the subheading, or the overall heading, it's also a political crisis. And just to indicate that I'm not the only one thinking along those lines, I've taken some quotes. The first is from a book by an American political scientist, international politics scholar, Eikenberry, who said that the bargains and institutions of the old order are under stress. Another one is a book title from another scholar who works in a tradition called transnational neo-pluralism. He talks about this is from a neo-Gramscian scholar, global crisis and the crisis of global leadership. I have a quote from the what's now called the International New York Times. Then it was the International Herald Tribune. Crisis, in short, is the new normal, and there is an increasing lack of consensus about the global way forward. And then finally, a title of a British book, Gridlock, Why Global Cooperation is Failing When We Need It Most. So there are quite a number of observers, including me, who think that this is not just a financial crisis or an economic crisis, but we are talking about some crisis of international leadership. And one could, of course, say, did we ever have international leadership? This front page from The Economist is from 2008. That was when the crisis was just beginning to unfold. That was also kind of pessimistic. What a way to run the world. But anyway, we do have this notion in my discipline of international political economy to talk about hegemonic projects or periods of fairly stable leadership configurations in the international political economy. And I address that from a transnational perspective, because increasingly we have to see this as something that generates conflicts within countries and between countries. So what we are talking about is the articulation of national and international orders and leadership projects. And to explain that, I'll give a little history in a while, but it's about changing domestic elite coalitions and conflicts within countries and the patterns of popular support, and how they articulate together internationally, and leadership projects are created at the international level. And that's where we also talk about transnational elites and global governance as a way of addressing this issue, where we see policy formation as being something that takes place across borders and between countries. We see cooperation of elites across borders, and we also see transnational conflicts. And to illustrate that, or to give you some background, I'll give a little historical background. I think it's fairly common among economists to compare the current situation to the crisis in the 1930s, because it's said to be the most serious economic crisis since the 1930s. But I think from a political science and political economy perspective, it's more instructive to compare it to the crisis of the 1970s, because it's the same kind of international order we are talking about now. And so I think it's fairly established now to say that we can divide this history in a period of what's become known as embedded liberalism, which began, you can always discuss the precise dates, but it lasted until circa 1971. Then we had a decade of crisis, political disagreement and contestation, and then we got into what later became known as, in my discipline, as the neoliberal period. I'll say more about it. and later, and then the current crisis. And I'll say a bit more to explain these notions. What characterized what became known as embedded liberalism was this mix of ongoing trade liberalization at the international level, but the preservation, in particular, of capital controls that allowed nations to pursue fairly independent national policies. And that was a period where in Europe and also in the US, we had what you could call a Keynesian welfare state being built up and evolved. That model came into crisis for many reasons, not only economic reasons. I just listed two here. Economic internationalization, in particular the internationalization of finance, the creation of the euro-dollar markets and other developments, but also increasing demands on the national welfare systems. To that we can add, for instance, the costs for the Americans of the war in Vietnam, etc. A whole range, set of economic reasons, political reasons that led to a crisis for this development model, this global development model. The reason I bring it up is that I think today two things are particularly important to learn from that period, namely the duration of the crisis. It took more or less 10 years from the crisis became quite open and visible with the Nixon shocks in 1971, and until you could say that a kind of international consensus led by the Americans and the British, Reagan, Thatcher, a new kind of policy doctrine, it became established and became the kind of new normal along which all policy debates percolated for the ensuing years. And so it defined the new period of intensified globalization. First point is it took this many years, periods of political contestation, disagreement, trial and error, etc. Second point is that there was no clear blueprint. It was not that in the middle of the crisis you can see here is the new model. Various things were launched, various policy labels were introduced, supply-side economics, monetarism, magic of the market, structural reform. Also the Washington Consensus was a label that got used. Eventually scholars, and perhaps in particular critical scholars, gave it the name neoliberalism. That, my point here is that it evolved as a result of political contestation over a long period of time. And of course, I bring it up because I think the current situation is somewhat similar. We had a crisis. You can always again discuss the starting point, was it 2007 or 2008? But it takes time before a kind of new political consensus about the basic parameters for a new global leadership project has been developed. Characteristic of this period, of course, was that globalization intensified and we had increased liberalization in the WTO, we had liberalization of capital movements, TRIPS agreement, several other things. I assume you're familiar with those. Also associated with this model was a retrenchment of the welfare state, a focus on structural reforms, which generated a lot of resistance and criticism from many sides. But it's also a period that has been marked by pretty strong growth internationally. We've seen hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty around the world. That's the other side of the coin that I think should also be remembered. We've also seen well-documented rises in inequality, and we saw increased what's known as financialization, the increased importance of the financial sector, all the innovation, the new derivatives, instruments, and so on, which was at least what triggered the crisis towards the end of it. So that's where we are now, that this growth model, this international, transnational elite project is got into crisis, and we are, in a sense, waiting, but also working on creating a new project, a new leadership project, a new transnational hegemonic project. And what are the contours of such a project, if there will be one at all? When I see the output of international institutions, such as the OECD, also the World Bank, also the United Nations systems, etc., there seems to be some kind of consensus, and also actually in the business community. If you look at a range of international business associations and what comes out of the World Economic Forum meetings in Davos and other places, I think most nicely summarized by this quote by the OECD Secretary General some years ago: a stronger, greener, and fairer world economy. There's this emphasis on strengths. That means robust, sustainable growth, growth that in economic terms is sustainable, not so crisis-prone as what we've seen before, but also greener. And if you look at the discourses from many international institutions, it's about environmental sustainability, it's about greening businesses. There's also a lot of talk about that in the business community all around the world, much emphasis on green, but also talk about a fairer world economy in the OECD language. And that includes a range of things. It means also bringing developing countries more into the process of economic growth. It means inclusive in terms of creating employment, having emphasis there. So it includes also a greater concern with justice and equality, such issues. So if there is a kind of global elite consensus emerging, it is about all these nice things. We want to create a growth model that can deliver on all fronts. And of course, personally, I hope that it will be possible, but I'm not sure because the reality is different as we see it today. There is consensus and cooperation internationally in many areas, but there's also much division and conflict within and between countries, which make this articulation of such a new project difficult. And I'll point to what I see as some of the most important issues, but before that, I'll just give you some indications of why I think it's justified to talk about a kind of political crisis. Political crisis in the US, I suppose you can accept that proposition that the way the Congress and President are interacting is not very successful. There is simply a deep division within the government. We've seen the budget difficulties in solving the deficit problems, solving budget problems. It's a very unfortunate political system within the US. There are clearly a kind of political crisis, and it's not just between Democrats and Republicans. We also see divisions within both parties. And I really think that that is important because of the global role of the US. US has been the global leader for the last half century, and in spite of all the talk about a European common foreign policy and all the talk about the rise of China, I really don't see any potential challengers at the moment. So the fact that the American political system is so, well, actually dysfunctional for the time being is quite serious as I see it. So we do have a weakened US leadership internationally. And in Europe, we have the sovereign debt crisis in the south. We have Euroscepticism on the rise in several countries. Look at Britain, look at my own country, look at, I think, in Austria as well. Look, in many countries, there is divisions and growing divisions within Europe about the future direction of the European project, more integration, less integration, etc. And a clear, coherent European foreign policy is not that visible, to say the least, for the time being. And then, if we all look at the North-South dimension, we have the WTO negotiations in the Doha round, which are moving very slowly, to say the least. I say they're stalled. There's simply a lack of agreement between the major players in North and South about where to take it here. And we also still have some dissatisfaction from emerging economies with the level, the extent of institutional reform in the international financial institutions. And since environmental issues are so important, we should also look at the global climate talks. I think they're central in many ways. And again, there may be some progress, but it's moving quite slowly. And in this area, we also have to see how different issues relate to each other. In particular, the North, there's a very strong North-South dimension here. But again, a slow-moving area. So what are the dividing lines in the transnational elites that I see are particularly important? One is the short-term discussion, austerity versus stimulus. And I'm not going to say more about that. I think that will eventually work itself out. Some doing one thing, others doing the other thing. That will not be with us for a longer term. I also think the next, which has been very important over the last 5 years, that's the concern with the real economy versus the financial sector. Now, we heard something about the progress. I think it's clear that there's been a lot of movement towards a stronger and better regulation of the financial sector. Basel III, the move towards macro-prudential regulation, etc. There has been clear movements, but I still think the jury is still out about how effective it's going to be. And this is not just a technical discussion, it's very much a political process. We see very tough political contestations with mainly regulators on one side and industry, financial industry representatives on the other side. So it's a political struggle going on there. And I think the financial sector has not lost its influence for many reasons. So let's see how successful this is going to be. I think we'll still have this contestation for several years ahead. And one of my points here is that this is a transnational line of conflict. It is, and probably the key players are the European, the British, and the American regulators versus the big financial private institutions in Wall Street, in the City of London, and to some extent also Europe. Second line of division is what I hear called green versus black business. It's a line of division along environmental politics and in particular climate politics, where we see black business. I know it may sound derogatory, but I think of in particular the carbon-intensive businesses, oil, coal, etc., who resist or try to limit movements towards a decarbonized economy. And on the other side, we have a range of businesses that have embraced efforts to move towards a carbon neutral economy. Businesses who see future markets in new technologies, in renewable energy and so on. And there's clearly been a shift in the strength of these two lobbies. The green lobby has grown tremendously on both sides of the Atlantic. I must say I know too little about the US, excuse me, about this part of the world. I can see I'm running out of time. Sorry, I'll move forward. I hope I explained green versus black. We still have this continued opposition from the black industries. We saw that in a struggle in the European Parliament recently, where a green proposal from the Commission was voted down in Parliament after a very heavy lobbying effort by black businesses. And finally, we have a line of conflict between old and emerging powers, where so many issues are on creating conflict and contestation: trade, investment, intellectual property rights, climate politics, etc. And what's the essence here is really, as I see it, a struggle between two sections of a global elite about who is going to benefit most from the continued industrialization of these countries. So the political process is still unfolding. I would like to see this realized. I'm not sure it's going to happen. I think we'll still see some greening. We will see little movement towards inclusion. We will see continued tough bargaining between North and South. And then I think my final comment is, and this is very unfortunate, that the current level of dysfunction, although in the American political system, although it's seldom set in the open, is to a large extent racially motivated. The extremists in the Republican Party simply do not want to see a black president succeed. The rationale behind much of their policies is to obstruct President Obama and simply prevent, and some of them have said it openly, and that's not going to disappear. It may subside a little, but that's why there'll be dysfunction and obstructionism in the American political system as long as he's president. And I think it's unfair. He doesn't deserve it. But a clear picture will not emerge until after that. And sorry for going over time. That's my final point.
Thank you very much, Professor Morten Aagaard.